Welcome back. So we've gone over all the menu items, and truthfully, you don't really need to set most of these. Default is going to be perfectly fine. Well, what I'm going to do is have you take a look, some very specific settings that while shooting, and this specifically is going to be for shooting manual, but truthfully, a lot of these settings are just universal. Whatever you're using on your computer, a lot of these settings are going to apply. So we're going to take a look at the most important settings that you need to change on your camera. And I'm going to do a better job today of explaining why. Before I'm just going over it. Now I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about what they are and why you need to change them. So by default, your camera is going to be right here on single one shot. These are your shutter options, and this is going to determine how your shutter works inside of your camera. We're going to have the option of single one shot, meaning every time you press the shutter button on your camera, it is going to take one photo. And then you're going to have a continuous mode. There's a couple different continuous modes. You might have continuous low, high, and silent. So what do these mean? Continuous low is going to take a series of exposures at low speed, meaning it's going to go click, click, click. Continuous high is going to be click, 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 so it's faster. And silent is going to make it so the shutter mechanism, as it the mirror goes up and it takes the picture, gives you a silent image. Now, the newer mirrorless cameras don't have mirrors that go up. And that's basically the main reason that you have a loud noise when you take a picture. It's really the mirror kind of flopping up really loudly. And so you're going to find that these mirrorless cameras, the new cameras, are really silent when you take a picture. And part of that problem is they can shoot in two different modes. One is when it uses the actual shutter going up, but it also can take a picture just using the plain EVF without that. Now, there's some issues into it, but we'll get into those issues later. By default, I'm going to suggest that you use continuous high. And the reason for this is when you're taking photos, you never know when something's going to happen. If you just need to mash down that button and go click, click, click because something happens, you want the best option to get those images. At first, you might struggle just trying to take one photo and it just sends off a burst and kind of scares you a little bit, but don't worry about it. You'll get control over it very quickly, so you'll be able to take one photo or a series of photos, however you want. In this situation, I'm going to suggest that you use continuous high. Now, some cameras aren't going to have a low and a silent setting. If they don't, it's either going to be one shot or continuous. Those are your only two options. Pick high. The next thing that you're going to see on your camera is going to be self-timer 2 seconds. So in this case, you're going to press the button. You're going to have 2 seconds, and then it's going to take a picture. One thing, remember, if you do set your camera to a self-timer, don't be surprised if you forget to reset it to one of these two settings. The next time you try to take a picture and you press a button, nothing happens. It's because it's on the self-timer mode. It's going to happen to you. It still happens to me. And the last one is self-timer 10 seconds. So in this situation, you're going to press the self-timer. It's going to count off 10 seconds, and then it's going to take the photo. So those are your options. So we'll go over those again. Single one shot. Every time you press the shutter, it's going to take one shot. Low, high, and silent, it's going to be continuous. So as long as your shutter button is held down, it's going to take images. You're going to have self-timer modes in 2 seconds and 10 seconds. All right, so the next one, by default, everybody is going to be in this single mode for this. And this is the autofocus mode. How does your camera's autofocus work? And I've labeled these so you can see the difference between Canon and Nikon. I don't think the majority of people are shooting Sony yet, but you can just look this up and it should be very similar. So single, one shot is Canon's word, or AFS for Nikon. So this is meaning single, and this is meaning single. What happens in this mode is your camera will focus, and when it gets in focus, it's going to stop. That's it. It's not going to try to focus anymore until you release the shutter button or the autofocus button and then press it again, and then it'll try to refocus. So this is good for a non-moving object. So if you're taking a portrait, this is great. You focus, the autofocus stops, and then you take a picture. So that's what single autofocus is for. Continuous autofocus is what it sounds like. It will continually focus as long as you're holding either the shutter button halfway down or the autofocus button down. The way this works is you just press it and the camera's going to keep focusing. You're going to see it kind of go in and lock on focus. And if you keep it held down, it's going to continue to try to track that subject. So if you're shooting sports or a moving object, this is going to be your best option because it's going to continually focus as your subjects move. You're going to either use AI servo for Canon or AFC, which is continuous for Nikon. This is my suggested setting, and I'll come back here and tell you why. Hybrid, what it does is it uses artificial intelligence to kind of decide whether it should use single or continuous. So if it thinks the subject isn't moving, it's going to use single. If it thinks the object is moving, it's going to use servo. So you're letting the camera make the decision. I think every time you let the camera make a decision, you set yourself in a situation where you're going to have some issues or it's not going to make the right decision. My suggestion is to use AI servo. I actually never take my camera basically off AI servo, unless for one situation. Occasionally, when you are shooting in really dark locations, continuous has trouble focusing. I will switch to one shot. One shot does a better job of focusing usually in low light. Otherwise, I use continuous, and there's a reason for this. So I've talked about this many times. I turn all of my cameras onto rear or back button focus. I don't use the shutter button in the front. I'm using the rear button. So the way I can use single when I'm doing a portrait is I focus, and as soon as my camera focuses, I let go of the autofocus button and bam, just like that. It's just like using single, but if I need my camera to continuously focus, I just hold down the button and it's going to keep focusing. So that's kind of how I manually toggle between the two. It's not a logical process to keep switching autofocus modes all the time. So I just leave mine in AI servo, and that's how I rectify the situation. I just let go of my focus button when I don't want to focus anymore, and my camera won't refocus. The next thing that we need to set is your ISO. Now, this is your camera's sensitivity to light, and this can be very confusing, and we're going to go into this just in the next couple of videos here. The numbers you see here are in full stops. What that means is if you have an intermediate or advanced camera, you might see numbers in between this. So you might see a 160 in between 100 and 200. These are your full stop numbers. It is very easy to figure them out because they always double. So we've got auto, and then 100 through 51,200 are your different ISO settings. By default, your camera might be in auto. Some cameras won't have an auto setting, but if you do have an auto setting, you need to take your camera out of auto and put it manually on one of these numbers. Part of learning to shoot in photography is learning to put your camera on a very specific number so you can get the best out of your camera. And that's what we're going to be learning in the upcoming videos. I'm going to take it off any auto setting, and we want to manually put it on a number. 100 to 200 is going to be good for bright sunlight, cloudy around 400, and then if you're in low light, anywhere from 800 to 6400. Usually you're not going to be shooting at 25,000 or 51,000 here. You're usually going to stay within this range here. So that is your camera's ISO. You need to understand and know how to quickly adjust your ISO in your camera. So go ahead and play around with it. Don't just set it once and never touch it again. It doesn't work like that. So right here, this is a Canon camera. This is my custom control. This is where I've switched to autofocus or rear button focus. So I'm using these two buttons back here. So I've set my autofocus on button, which is right here, and then my star button, which is this one right here, to autofocus. So you need to read in your manual how to change your camera to rear button autofocus. I think for beginners, this is a much better option than having your autofocus up here. So I'm turning it off here and putting it on here. you need to understand how to reformat your card. So after you've taken your images off your card, and you do not want to just take photos and leave your images on your card for months and months at a time. The chances of you losing or an SD card crashing are much higher than hard drive crashing or having issues with it. Well, I suggest every time that you take a photo, you move your images to 2 completely separate locations to back them up to ensure that you don't lose them. And then when you stick your card back in your camera, I want you to reformat. So you're going to hit format, you're going to select the card. If you have 2 cards, it's going to give you a little pop-up window and say, do you really want to format this card? And you're going to hit yes. You do not want to delete. Delete causes fragmentation in the card, and it's going to cause you long-term problems. Highlight alert is one of the options that I think is going to help you. This is going to make highlights blink when you've overexposed them. And if you do not know what I'm talking about, don't worry, we're going to be going over this in future videos, but it's going to blink when your highlights are too bright. You definitely never want to overexpose your highlights. You're better off shooting a little bit dark than you are a little bit light in photography. So in this case, if you're out in bright sunlight, sometimes it's hard to tell if your exposure is correct. What will happen is if you overexpose your highlights, they'll start to flash. On my camera, it flashes red. And so they'll flash and blink, and that way you know to reduce your exposure until those highlight alerts stop flashing. Color space and color gamut is really important in photography, and we'll go into this in just a separate video, just talking about color spaces and color gamuts. By default, your camera is going to be on sRGB. You want to move it to Adobe RGB. Now, if you're shooting RAW, this really isn't going to make a difference because RAW photos don't apply any settings in camera. It's done post-processing in a program like Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw. If you do shoot a JPEG from time to time, you definitely want it to be in Adobe RGB versus sRGB because it has a larger color gamut, meaning that you're going to be able to capture larger amount of color variations in Adobe RGB than you can in sRGB. So it's a much, much better option. White balance. Now, these are your white balance options. I'm actually going to tell you to just go ahead for the time being to leave it on auto white balance. Now, just like before, if you shoot JPEG, you definitely need to know how to adjust the settings here because you can't set them after the fact. But in RAW photography, you can apply this in Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw. So you don't have to apply it in camera. So I'm just going to leave it here. But once again, we have auto white balance. This is for sunny. This is for shady. This is for cloudy. This is for tungsten lights, which you don't really see anymore. They really should have an LED setting now. This is fluorescent. This is flash. This is custom, and this is Kelvin. And so light is measured in the Kelvin scale in photography. Now in Canon, this is called Auto Lighting Optimizer, and at the moment, I can't remember what it's called for Nikon, but I'll look it up and have a little word pop up here so you know exactly what this is called in the Nikon menu. But you want to turn this off. What it does is it tries to automatically adjust your exposure for what it thinks it should be right. You don't want that to happen. You want to turn this off, and by default, this is on. So make sure you disable this in your camera. Image quality. On this camera, we have some RAW options. I can shoot a full RAW, a medium-sized RAW, a small RAW. I always shoot RAW, so mine's going to be on RAW. These are your JPEG options here. For this tutorial and what I'm going to be teaching you in the future, I'm going to suggest that you just go ahead and stick your camera on RAW. Now, for those of you that are on a PC, a lot of PCs natively cannot open a RAW photo. So if you don't have a program that can open a RAW photo, you're not going to be able to view these images. So in this case, a lot of times you can save an image as a RAW and a JPEG. So every time you take a picture, it will save it as a RAW and a JPEG. So you'll be able to view them. Most camera companies offer you free software, however, to edit RAW photos. Nikon usually has some free software. Canon has free software. But most likely, if you're going to be into photography, you're going to be using some sort of photo editing program. Now, if you're on a Mac, Photos will edit RAW photos. If you have a really new camera, it might not be set up yet to edit that specific RAW file, but generally photos will edit RAW photos. But I'm going to suggest you shoot RAW. There's a amount of benefits. I'm not going to go into them because it could just confuse everybody at this point, but you definitely want to shoot RAW over JPEG. So right here, you can see my camera set up to shoot RAW and RAW. I could also set this up to shoot RAW here, JPEG here. If you only have one card, you can also activate a card to shoot RAW and JPEG at the same time. All right, and that's the end of the video. Hopefully this was helpful and you learned a little bit about how to set up your camera and really what's the most important settings that you need to adjust on your DSLR or mirrorless camera. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. If you have any comments or questions, you can leave those below. And as always, don't forget to subscribe.